We'll sing all three stanzas, 639. Number 482. 482, we'll sing the first and third. First and third, 482.
Then I know the sin
463. 463. We'll sing all three stanzas, 463. Okay. We're in 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 19. Looking at the life of Elijah through this summer, and we've gotten to where sometimes the servants, these old saints, seem to have been almost invincible. They were super Christian. You almost imagine with a SC on their shirt or something, their robes, I guess. Super Christian. And here the luster comes off, and we see a normal man who is very fearful, who is lost hope, and runs. And last week we began looking at what is called depression. We were going to substitute more of the words the Bible uses, because depression really covers a lot if you look in a medical terminology. And so we're looking more at the idea of discouragement, loss of hope, and that. We were looking at physical causes, and we looked at all kinds of causes of depression last week, things that we listed, and these are not exhaustive. You can be just too tired, I've discovered through the years that when I'm really tired, two things can seem like a whole big mountain to accomplish, and it may not be really. When we have a lot of stress, when we lack physical fitness, when we have medical issues or side effects from medicine, financial issues, when we overconsume the media, and I don't mean just the news, but entertainment, when we try to de-stress with just entertainment, too much social media, news, our work demands, trials, setbacks, allergies. It could be a time of sadness or loss. Maybe we've lost a job or a family or a friend or a way of life. Times of the year when there's less daylight, lack of sun. If it's really hot and humid all the time, some of us, that's a little more uncomfortable. Others, that's what you like. Joe Snedeker loves this kind of stuff on Channel 16. The hotter and the more humid it is, the better he likes it.
It's crazy.
Yeah, he always has been. It might be the anniversary of a sad event. Those are things that we take in. The curse, remember we spent time talking about this last week. The further from creation we get, the more the curse deepens man's imperfections. That it is real. Spiritual, we're not handling a crisis we are facing in a right way. That's going to add to it. Anxiety, we don't have the relationship not that we desire, but that we could have with the Lord. I would hope there's one area I think in our lives it's okay for discontent, and that is we wish we could do better and be a better Christian and closer to the Lord. But we talked about anger and its effects, the root of bitterness, personality types. I think there's a thing to some personality types struggling with that a little bit more. Over busy schedule with no reprieve for rest, a quick sudden change in circumstances, perfectionism, ongoing conflict with someone, brain disease or injury, or just growing older. Now, why did we list so many? Daniel, did you write those down that you said you thought of last week?
Yes.
Okay.
Strained or broken relationship.
Strained.
Whether it's a mate, parent, child, sibling, in-law, a friend. Strained or broken relationship. Failure in some endeavor.
Yes.
Once again, it could be a marriage, it could be a job, it could be in ministry. Just a feeling of failure. I tried and I didn't do it. Another one I thought of was crisis.
Crisis.
And another biblical word I found was distress.
Distress.
It's used quite a bit in Scripture.
Okay. So if you were to pull out a concordance, which words could we look up and find distressed? What other ones did we say last week? I've already used one tonight. Discouragement or dismayed if you're using the old one. Cast down was another one. If you're looking for the antonym that would help also put context to it, what would that be? I've used that word. Loss of hope. You could look up the word hope also. So, now why did we mention all those? And thank you, Daniel, for thinking of those. He mentioned last week, he said, I thought of some more. Because there's a lot of contributors. It's not just necessarily one thing. A lot of times what happens is folks don't bother to dig. I just feel down. I just feel depressed. Well, why? I don't know. But then they go and they pay a counselor or a therapist, I don't know how much per hour, to talk through it. When you can sit down yourself and start listing things that are going on in your life. You can look at stress indicators. There's actually, Daniel might know where, I don't know if you're in your line of work, if you work with them or not, but there's actually these big lists of, you can score stress and kind of get a idea of how much stress that you face. And they list all kinds of things from all over the board. There's just a lot of different things. Now in 1 Kings 19, what we began looking at was, we're not dealing with depression, we're dealing with how do we deal with it? how did Elijah deal with it, and how did God deal with Elijah? Because in the days in which we live, as the culture grows darker, I think it's going to be harder for the Christian to, and one of the points I want to make sure I add in on Sunday, I was sharing this with Becca last night, was I want to make sure on Sunday we talk about, so now that we've heard a series on joyfulness, we're always going to be joyful, right? No. Why? Because it's a fruit of the Spirit. We grow. It's a characteristic that should become more common, and we want to attain towards that. But are we still going to face discouragement in our lives? Absolutely. Are we going to feel some days just like we rolled out of bed and feel down for some reason? Sure. That's part of life in a sin-cursed world. So, how did what were the effects of discouragement and the loss of hope on Elijah? How did they affect him? Anyone remember the first one from last week that's really the fuel in the fire? He ran away, but what's the real fuel that got everything going? Fear. And what do we learn? What have we said about fear in the series on anxiety? No, this was back when we probably were still at home. Fear leads to more fear. One fear is going to beget another fear. And why? Because it's just going to grow and it's going to produce fruit along the way. So that's something very much so to watch out for when you have lost hope or are distressed or cast down. Look for the fear. What's going on? What am I fearful about? A lot of different questions you can ask yourself even in that arena. But what am I? Because one fear is going to beget more fears. Then he ran from God's place for him. Yeah, the second effect was he ran from God's place for him. A lot of times, I think I talked about this a little bit on Sunday, when we face these times of loss of hope, of being down, of discouragement, of just being distressed, we tend to not run to God. We end up in a very vulnerable position where, at least I find this in my life, it's the temptation to handle things the old way is very tempting. How many of you found that? Maybe not the teens so much, but I have found that to be very true. Whenever I'm down is whenever the temptations come stronger to those weaknesses in the flesh, the sins or sin that does so easily trip us up, beset us. It gets very easy in those times to not run to God, but end up kind of running from God and handling it in an old sinful way. The third effect was he lost sight of the reality with God. He loses sight of reality with God. What do I mean by that? Well, he just comes to a point, I'm a dead man. I might as well, he had trusted God up to this point to deliver him and take care of him the years it hadn't rained. He had trusted God. Remember the book Cherith, and then the widow Zarephath, and he trusted God to protect him when he confronted Ahab. Remember Obadiah? Obadiah was struggling to trust God to take care of him, even though he trusted God to use him to take care of 100 prophets. You would think trust would beget trust, wouldn't you? No, it doesn't seem to work that way. It can, but if we're not careful, fear begets fear, but trust doesn't necessarily lead to more trust unless we're very walking with the Lord and thinking that way. He had trusted God to protect him. He had trusted God to answer his prayer and show that there was only one true God in Israel. He trusted God to send rain, and there was no sign of rain at that point. At least tonight when you walk in, there's at least boomers or thunder boomers around different places. But all of a sudden, word comes that Jezebel's going to have him, and he loses sight of reality with God. What's the reality of God for us? Name some of the promises that when we face discouragement or distress, right? What are some of the promises that we can think of that remind us that God is real and this is what's real, not necessarily our fear? He'll never leave us. never forsake.
Always wants what's best for us.
He's always working for what's best for us. He never stops working. Daniel?
This week started memorizing Deuteronomy 4:30 and 31. I picked certain phrases out of there. When you are in distress, turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice. He will not forsake you nor destroy you.
There's the temptation too. How many times when we're going through, does our attitude kind of change towards what is God trying to do? Kill me? Not necessarily those words, but we kind of, feel like, here we go again, Lord. Why? The loss of hope then magnifies dangers of his situation. It actually exaggerates his situation. What was the danger of his situation? Jezebel would kill him. Was it a real danger? Sure. But who's in control here, and who had kept him up to this point? God had. So it magnified or exaggerated his situation. The next effect is, let's look at verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. The fifth effect of this is he isn't able to think straight. He isn't able to think straight. He doesn't stop to think this all through. And what I mean by that is, there's two ways to think things through. You can focus on your problems and your circumstances and think it through without any regard of what is God trying to do, what is God doing, putting God in the picture. Or you can put God in the picture and stream it through him. Okay, God, what's going on here? What's real? What's not real? Can I trust you to protect me? You've protected me thus far. But this shows Elijah's vulnerability. And so one of the things when we lose hope, when we get discouraged, when we get distressed, when we're cast down, it's important to figure out why, because that fear is going to distort our thinking. Now, can we figure out why? Well, if we're using the Bible and asking the Lord to help us, then yeah, he can put that spotlight. Search me, O God, and try me, know my ways. God can help us figure out maybe what's going on. Maybe we need to sit down and talk with a godly friend or counselor. But that's where the danger this is where the danger, it's bad enough that he already got fear going on. It's bad enough he's already ran from God. It's bad enough he removes God out of the picture. He isn't seeing the reality of God in his situation. And now he's exaggerating what's going on. But this is really a tipping point when we're not able to think straight, when we're not thinking biblically. Well, we got a sixth effect here. It says, I am no better than my fathers. What comes to you from that phrase? Something we all do, probably. Maybe not so much anymore if we compares himself to others. Compares himself to others. Ever done that in your lifetime? I read a quote not long ago. When you're 20, you think everyone's thinking. When you're 20, you think everyone's thinking about you, and you wonder what they're thinking. When you're 40, you finally begin to not care what everyone's thinking. When you're 60, you find out they weren't thinking about you. Compares himself to others. This is a very dangerous thing. Paul in Corinthians, you have to get a concordance, and I don't have one right here, but Paul in one of the Corinthian epistles talks about the foolishness of comparing ourselves with others. It's easy to look at someone else. There's two dangers here. One is you can always find someone better than you at what you're comparing in the area you're comparing yourself to. If I'm a bench player in baseball, it's easy. I'm not. But I might look at one of the great all-time greats playing the game and go, wow, I'm not that good, and I would be honest. But I'm also better than a lot of other people that would never have made the bench even. So you can really push yourself down because you're looking, and one of the things when counselors are dealing with people in this is they are looking at other people. Well, I'm not as good looking as that person, or don't have this. It's an envy almost. Of course, the Bible warns us against that. But then there's the other side where we can puff ourselves up and think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think, because we can always find someone worse at something than we are. Usually. Maybe not always, but usually. Someone that isn't as good as we are at something. And we need to be careful both ways. One, we get a swelled head, and the other way we suffer. God did not make you or I to be like someone else or do what someone else does. God made you to be unique with a distinct personality and distinct gifts to serve Him uniquely. I'll just read it one more time. God didn't make you to be like someone else or do what someone else does. God made you to be unique with a distinct personality and distinct gifts to serve Him uniquely. In the book of Psalms, it says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. God does not make mistakes in how He makes people. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. God does not expect you to be as good as someone else or think you're better than someone else. It's in Romans chapter 12. He says, let each man not think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly. We don't compare ourselves to others. We try to become what God wants us to become, but we still have a sin nature at the core. So what's the problem with Elijah says, I am not better than my fathers? Let me see something here. One of the problems is it might show some motivation of why he was doing what he was doing. I'm not saying it is, but this might be appearing into the motivation. Now, let's look at it. If you're Elijah and God has miraculously provided for you with scavenger birds who usually eat everything they get their beaks on, and a widow of Zarephath, cruse of oil and flour that never ran out, there was always just enough, and you had been used by God to raise her son from the dead, and confronted the wicked king Ahab and defeated all the prophets of Baal, and saw God miraculously bring down fire from heaven and consume up that sacrifice, and then you had prayed for God to send rain, and you persisted and saw God use the cloud like a small hand that just flooded the earth. Would you not think that national revival was about to happen, maybe? Because this is where he despairs. He says, I'm the only one left that I've not bowed my knee, and I'm no better than my fathers. And you had some mighty prophets that came before Elijah. And they had the same problems he had with the people of Israel. It's the reason God called them stiff-necked and stubborn. And I wonder if he didn't think revival was going to come, and it just went flat. All this I've done is in vain. I'm no better than my fathers. Well, God wasn't asking Elijah's success to be based on the nation turned back to God. God's idea of success was Elijah's faithfulness, no matter what happened. You know, sometimes I know I've faced this discouragement through the years, and God's still working on me. It doesn't matter. You know, he called Philip out of Samaria, where a revival was going on, to win one Ethiopian to the Lord. But how many sheep did the Lord leave behind to go find the one? He left 99 to find the one. You know, and so our motivation can't be, we're going to do great things for God and see God do one. Maybe God has us where he has us just for one soul, or to be the one that waters or plants the gospel seed. It's nice to be able to reap after time, but this has a huge effect on him. He compares himself to others. It might be appearing into why God exposing why he was doing what he was doing. Elijah, I didn't call you to turn the nation. I've called you to be faithful to me and give them the warning. And you've done marvelous things, so we need to be very careful that we don't in turn think that we're failures for God because we don't see visible results, or because things don't seem to happen like we thought they would. So, next obvious effect of discouragement: take away my life. He despairs of life. He despairs of life. And discouragement, loss of hope, if we allow it to run its natural course, allow it to continue to beat us down and not bring God in the picture, and we aren't thinking straight biblically, we're going to despair of life. Life is not worth living as it is. Now, that doesn't necessarily... Now, the ultimate of that, obviously, is someone who would contemplate suicide. But it covers all the gamuts in between. It can cover someone who just wants to change their life. You know, sometimes pastors, I'm using this as an example, where I'm not doing this. Sometimes pastors get so discouraged, they just want to go do anything else but pastor. Just go somewhere else and do something else. You know, they might try to just all of a sudden changes in their life, you know, that seem like a really good idea, but we need to pray over about changes we're going to make in our lives. Despairing of life. We want it to change, and we want it to change suddenly, and if that thinking does go on, it can lead down the path of suicidal thoughts. Life isn't worth living. And yet, if God made you unique, he made you for him, life is worth living. The next one, he stubbornly keeps his point of view. You saw that in verse 4. In verse 5, he eats and he sleeps, and he goes, eats and sleeps some more. And you look at verse 10. I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, as God confronts him again. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. He stubbornly holds to his point of view. We're never guilty of this, are we? When we are discouraged and lose hope, and someone tries to encourage us, or say, hey, you know, what do you think God says? You know, what is God trying to do? What is God's perspective on this? What is the promises of God? You know, we can be quite stubborn to hold our point of view. We're not going to change. I'm right. And yet, how many different, and look at verses 4 and verse 10. How many different things can you pick out of those two verses that he says that are not accurate? Biblically, they're not accurate. He's obviously not thinking straight.
Verse 10, he says, I'm the only one left, and that wasn't true, there were still several.
Yep, I'm the only one left. Verse 14, add that one in, maybe that says it all again. What about that verse 4 where he says, take away my life? Is that accurate, biblically accurate? Is that thinking straight? I'm not better than my fathers. Is that accurate if the Psalms say I am fearfully and wonderfully made? They're going to kill me. I've been jealous for your sake and it's been all in vain. Is that biblically accurate? So here you can just see, just by looking at a little bit, we can stubbornly cling to our point of view that is biblically inaccurate. But we're right. That isn't going to help our discouragement, loss of hope. It's going to make it worse. It's not going to help. It's going to make it worse. And a lot of times what you find with this loss of hope is the description is it just seems to keep getting darker. Well, he said it in verse 4, he says it in verse 10, he says it in verse 14. He stubbornly holds that point of view, and it's not making it any better. And it's just as biblically inaccurate as what he said the first time. Look at one more. The next one is he seeks relief without God's solutions considered. He seeks relief without God's solutions considered. What might be some of God's solutions here? Well, we know what they are because we see them down here. Have you ever stopped though when you're in this, have lost hope or distress, cast down, just to see what are some of the things God could do? What are some of God's solutions? A lot of times God's solutions are not changing our circumstances. It's changing us. It's trying to change us. But we'll stop there for tonight. Adam, you want to stop that? And we'll come back next Wednesday night, Lord willing, and